So good morning, afternoon, or evening, and a very warm welcome to this UNIDIR side event to the first committee plenaries of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Disarmament Verification from Mistrust to Cooperation. My name is Vivian Zhang. I am a graduate professional at UNIDIR's WND program, and I am delighted to moderate this event. I should note that this event will be recorded, and the recording will be made available online in the coming days. If you encounter any technical difficulties, please email the contacts as indicated in the chat. As you are well aware, as international relations have become increasingly complicated in recent years, disarmament processes and cooperation between arms control actors have stalled. The relationships between states are in many cases characterized by a considerable degree of mistrust, making verifiable arms control agreements difficult. But even so, we believe that well-designed verification mechanisms could work even in adversarial environments, and these mechanisms could provide sufficient confidence in compliance obligations to sustain arms control. UNIDIR's WMD program has been working on various aspects of disarmament verification, from missile materials to nuclear warheads. We have been supporting the work of the group of governmental experts on nuclear disarmament verification. Also, this year, we completed two major research projects on missile verification and on verifying disarmament in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We'll post links to the reports of these two projects in the chat. The presentations that you will hear today reflect some of the findings of these projects, as all our speakers contributed to this work. We are also glad to have this event sponsored by the Government of New Zealand. They supported our TPNW work this year and has been a great supporter of many other UNIDIR projects throughout the years. And with that, I would like to give the screen to Dr. John Borey, who is the Principal Disarmament Advisor at the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, based in the Permanent Mission of New Zealand in Geneva. Please, Dr. John Borey, the screen is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Vivian, and kia ora, everybody. It gives me a lot of pleasure to be with you virtually here to open this event and to welcome your participation. And Aotearoa New Zealand is a firm supporter of nuclear verification. We recognise that it's essential in underpinning efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons with a view to the eventual achievement of a nuclear weapon-free world. And it means that, as Vivian mentioned, over the last several years, New Zealand's contributed financially to several projects at UNIDIR related to nuclear verification, most recently on verification approaches to fulfilling the obligations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in the event a nuclear armed state decides to join. But of course, the remit of today's UNIDIR event is much broader than that, although I'd note that so too are some of the findings from that research. New Zealand's a long-standing supporter of UNIDIR, and we recognise both the Institute's valuable convening power on disarmament and arms control related issues, and the substantive contribution that the Institute can and does make in framing solutions to overcome practical problems in that field. And as a former UNIDIR senior staff member myself, I can attest to the Institute's continued professionalism and ongoing value. And so it gives me real pleasure today to introduce a panel of several experts with whom I've collaborated in the past and all of whom I hold in very high regard. Now, verification is a long-standing challenge, and it goes back as far as the origins of disarmament and arms control activities, in fact. And in this regard, it's notable that bilateral nuclear weapon-related verification processes involving the Soviet Union, later Russia, and the United States in particular provided many data points and have shaped much of the thinking on verification since the Cold War. And those verification approaches, mechanisms, and activities had to be developed in an atmosphere of intense mistrust. And I hope the panelists will explore this in their talks today. And I'd actually just give a brief shout out to an excellent study that two of our panelists produced, Pavel Podvig and Amy Woolf. You may not be able to see it on the screen, but this is a couple of years old. It's from the Institute's Monitoring, Verification and Compliance series. It's called Compliance Resolution in US-Russian Arms Control, and it's on the UNIDIR website. It's worth checking out. It's a very interesting study. It's abundantly clear today that mistrust between nuclear armed states is on the rise again, and it underlines the importance of nuclear verification exactly at a time when it seems most challenged. So what does this mean for the future of US-Russia arms control, and indeed more broadly than that. After all, we see a more complex international environment with more parties of relevance. If we're ever to move far toward the goal of a nuclear weapon-free world, how and which verification approaches and techniques can productively be applied in plurilateral and multilateral settings, transparently, verifiably, and irreversibly. At the same time, the particularities of each of the arsenals and attendant infrastructure of the world's 9 nuclear armed states are all very, very different and have to be taken into account somehow. So how should we do that? Moreover, what kind of broader transformations do we need to see for this to occur? And there's technology, of course, and in fact, UNIDIR's WMD program have published quite a lot on this in the context of their WMD compliance and enforcement work stream. But there's also going to have to be a change in thinking among policymakers. And in that regard, there's a chicken and egg angle to all of this. Which comes first, trust or verification? And I suspect Nick Ritchie, who long ago was one of my doctoral supervisors, will have insights here based on his chapter for UNIDIR on the role of power politics in shaping approaches to verification, which I, for one, am keen to learn more about. And I'd also give a brief plug to Nick's latest article in International Relations, which is excellent if you want to think about some of the overall issues in nuclear disarmament, including how these link up to verification. So lastly, if we consider verification as a way for states to demonstrate in practice their commitment to the obligations that they accept, whether in a legally binding way or implicitly, what can we usefully learn from past experiences? And what does it mean for the future? It seems to me that this is a question for all of us, not just for the nuclear armed states. In this regard, I note that states parties to the TPNW have already begun to grapple with such issues since the adoption and international entry into force of that treaty, in terms of an action plan agreed in June of this year in Vienna, and the setting up of an intercessional process to give effect to that action plan and the obligations of the treaty. Broad parameters for TPNW Article 4 implementation, such as deadlines, were collectively established, and the co-chairs for the new process, of which New Zealand is one and Mexico the other, have identified major topics for further work. So we're definitely tuned into what we can learn from this panel and from current work on nuclear verification in general, whether it be from UNIDIR, the UN group of government experts on nuclear disarmament verification, or the International Partnership on Nuclear Disarmament Verification, for that matter. In closing, I'd like again to thank UNIDIR for their research and ongoing efforts, and for working so well in partnership with the New Zealand government, especially Pavel, Jamie Revel, and other colleagues on the WMD program. I look forward to hearing more about their research today at this event, as well as what Nick and Amy can teach us. And I really look forward to the kinds of questions and other responses it generates. So I thank you and turn the floor back to you, Vivian.
Thank you very much. I also look forward to our discussions today. And I would like to introduce now the format of the discussions, which will be a series of presentations followed by a moderated Q&A segment. And you can now submit written questions at any time using the Q&A function without waiting until the end of the presentations. And these questions will be visible only to the speakers and the UNIDIR team producing this event. We'll moderate the questions and have the speakers address them. And I will try to cover as many questions as possible, but we can make no guarantees to get them all as we have limited time. And now, starting with the presentations, we will hear from 3 distinguished experts today, who I will now introduce. I should note that all panelists are speaking in their own personal capacity. So first, we have Amy Woolf, who is a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security of the Atlantic Council, and a consultant at UNIDIR. Previously, she had served as a specialist in nuclear weapons policy at the Congressional Research Service of the US Library of Congress. Secondly, we have Nick Ritchie, who is a senior lecturer in international security at the University of York. He researches and teaches in the areas of international relations and international security, with a particular focus on nuclear disarmament, proliferation, and arms control, as well as US and UK national security. Last but not least, we have Pavel Podvig, who is a senior researcher in the WMD program at UNIDIR. He also runs his own research project on Russian nuclear forces and is additionally a researcher with the program on science and global security at Princeton University. And Pavel's areas of expertise include nuclear disarmament, arms control, fissile material, and verification. And thank you all very much for joining us. Before we start with the presentations, I would like to remind the audience that you can submit written questions using the Q&A functions. And now I would like to give the floor to Amy for a presentation on the past and future of cooperative means of verification in US-Russia arms control. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to thank UNIDIR and Vivian for inviting me to participate today, John for his warm words, and just reiterate that I am speaking on my own behalf. I don't represent anyone who I am currently or formerly affiliated with, but this is all my work. So I'm going to talk about US-Russian arms control primarily, but before I do that, I'm going to lay out some terms of art in the monitoring and verification world, in part so you can understand what I'm talking about, but mostly because I think it's important to distinguish between the different elements of this area of expertise. So the first thing, and this should be obvious, is that monitoring is the process of collecting information on the forces and activities of the other country. It's the part of the process where you go out with either remote sensing equipment or shared cooperative monitoring to collect data. It just collects data. Verification, the broader process of verification, is the process of analyzing this data, then comparing it to the forces and activities that you would expect to see if a country were compliant with the terms of a treaty, and then reaching the political judgment, not a data judgment, but a political judgment about whether the data matches the expectations and compliance has occurred. Now, I want to be clear that verification is not about the search for violations. We don't, in the US-Russian, US-Soviet experience, have the capabilities or did not have the intention to go running around each other's countries looking under every rock for evidence of violations. We collected data to determine whether compliance was occurring. The goal here, though, is not to provide absolute assurance that compliance is 100% perfect. That's just not a feasible measure. The goal is to provide confidence in compliance to a high level, but perfection is not necessarily the goal. You would often hear during the negotiations and the debates over US-Russian and US-Soviet treaties a political demand for perfection. If we can't know for certain that the other side is not breaking any of these little rules, then we can't sign the treaty. You'd hear that in the political debates, but that was usually a sign that someone was calling for more intrusive monitoring, recognizing that more is better, but you're never going to get the best, or that it was a mask for a broader rejection of arms control. Participating in the negotiations and in the process, it became obvious that perfection wasn't possible, and it also wasn't necessary, because the goal is to provide confidence that compliance exists, so that the parties can trust that the arms control process serves their national security interests. And since both Vivian and John have raised the question of trust several times, I'd like to just stop for a minute and tell you what I mean by trust. It is more than obvious that the United States and Soviet Union did not trust each other as either adversaries or even negotiating partners during the negotiations throughout the Cold War. They did not trust each other as countries, but they trusted that the arms control process, particularly if it had a sufficient verification component, could improve their national security. So trusting the other country to do the right thing is not necessary. Trusting that you can confirm that they are doing what you expect them to do, and that when they do that, your security is improved. That's the core of monitoring and verification. Now, I've just emphasized repeatedly that this is not about looking for violations. On the other hand, the ability to detect violations matters. First, if you can't detect violations, then they would likely happen without you knowing. So being able to detect them makes them more costly and more complex, and therefore deters violations. So you want to be able to detect obvious or evident violations so that you can deter them from happening. Also, the ability to detect violations, particularly if they're militarily significant, provides warning of non-compliant activity in time to respond to the military threat of that violation. So there is a significant component of the monitoring and verification process that focuses on looking for violations, but the goal is to confirm compliance and be confident in compliance. So before I turn to the specifics, let me just generally say what you would look for in a monitoring and verification regime to get to these goals. First, you want monitoring systems and capabilities that provide the information needed to look for a range of violations. But this is less about the monitoring itself than about your creative imagination of pathways to violation. So as you're negotiating the treaty, you think about what could go wrong here and do I have the means to detect that? So it's not just a matter of piling on more monitoring capability, it's also knowing what you're looking for if you're looking for violations. Second, you want to devise monitoring systems and capabilities that allow the countries to collect the data needed to verify compliance with the arms control agreements. I would argue that's the central core. Can you get the picture painted that tells you whether or not compliance is occurring? And third, you want to devise monitoring systems and capabilities that provide the countries with the opportunity to demonstrate their compliance and affirm their commitment to the goals of the arms control agreement. Even in a relatively adversarial arms control process, the verification regime provides the room to demonstrate the commitment to arms control. So what did this look like in the US Soviet and the US Russian arms control experience? First, your treaty text is the foundation of your verification regime. Often in the international arms control environment, people think, well, this is what the treaty does, and this is the verification regime I'm slapping on top of it. That's not how it worked in the US Soviet and US Russian experience. The terms of the treaty laid out the limits, the definitions, the collateral constraints, the procedures that you had to follow to implement the treaty. And no amount of monitoring or technology or data collection could allow you to confirm compliance was occurring unless you knew what compliance looked like. And the treaty defined what compliance looked like. Then the verification system establishes a baseline for the forces and activities that exist at the beginning of the treaty. Again, you're starting with what does this look like? So the countries would provide data exchanges, they'd restrict the locations of their weapons systems, they'd update the data, they'd notify when they moved things. They were basically painting a continuous moving picture of what was going on with the forces limited by the treaty. The verification regime would also establish processes and procedures to follow when adding or eliminating items. If you brought a new item into the force, you would notify that that happened and you'd exhibit it. If you removed an item from the force, you would use specified elimination procedures or conversion procedures so that it no longer counted. And compliance with this process of implementation matters as much as the confirmation of the outcome, because you can imagine that I would say, well, I'm not going to use this missile anymore. I'm going to stick it in the back of the garage. That's not compliance with the treaty. You have to break it down according to treaty terms. So process is as important as outcome. Fourth, the countries could each use remote sensing, non-cooperative means of verification, satellites, remote sensing equipment, to snap pictures on their own, to check on the data on their own. And this provided not only a means to count what was out there, but because neither side knew when the other side would be watching, you could catch evidence that something was askew. For example, if the treaty limits the locations of all weapons counted under the treaty, and your satellite took a picture of something 20 miles away, you'd scratch your head and go, that doesn't look right. So the remote monitoring, even without cooperation, provided a spot check on the cooperative monitoring. And finally, there were on-site inspections. And yes, I leave those to the end of the list. I'll explain why in a minute. These are highly scripted and circumscribed. The inspectors do not go to a facility and wander around looking for whatever they can see. The goal is to confirm the accuracy of the data that has been exchanged prior to the inspection. So the data says there are 10 missiles at this base. The inspectors go and count 10 missiles. If they count 9, they wonder where's that 10th. If they count 11, they know they have a problem. So they're confirming the data. But while they're there, even though they don't get to wander around, they do get some tangential data on the state of the force. For example, oh, they're clearing trees over there. Maybe they're going to build a new building. Now I'll use my satellites to watch what's going on. But the primary goal is to confirm the data. It's a snapshot that confirms the data that was provided in the moving picture. So as I said, I put inspections as the last step, not the first step in a comprehensive verification regime. There's little doubt that the United States and Soviet Union would have been unable to conclude many of their more comprehensive treaties like INF and START without their agreement to allow inspections and other cooperative monitoring mechanisms. But the inspections and the breadth of the cooperation responded to a requirement for demonstrating a commitment to the value of the treaty. It was not just about collecting data, but about cooperating to implement the treaty, cooperating to confirm compliance, cooperating to demonstrate a commitment to the treaty, and in the process, getting used to just plain cooperating with each other. And there's tons of evidence out of the history of US, Soviet, and US Russian arms control that the process of implementing the treaty in a cooperative manner improved confidence in the commitment to the treaty by both parties. So it's all about building an environment where even if you don't trust the other party to the treaty, you trust that the treaty is serving your national security interests. So finally, let me just address the question of whether this kind of verification regime could help with a return to arms control if, when, whether the United States and Russia get there. A few points here. Return to arms control requires a return to the shared commitment to arms control as a tool to manage nuclear cooperation. Even when the countries didn't trust each other, this was a shared commitment that this kind of cooperation and restrictions on our forces would serve our national security interests. And as I said at the start, you can never be 100% certain in compliance. There's always going to be some uncertainty. So we need to return to the times when you could assess whether the benefits of cooperating to manage nuclear competition and restrict your forces are high enough, the benefits of doing that, to accept that there are some uncertainties in the compliance assessments. The way I look at it is you can live in a world where things are restricted and competition is managed, but there's a little bit of uncertainty, or where there's no restriction and no competition, but a lot of uncertainty. So you have to decide where the sweet spot is there. Now, adding technologies and new monitoring capabilities can help build that confidence, but they cannot overcome the lack of political will. Arms control is a political endeavor. Verification is a bit of political in process. And the demands for added technology and new monitoring capabilities can seem reasonable from a political perspective as a way to build trust. But if the demands don't have a sense of balance and limits, they are more of an impediment to arms control than a path to future trust. So that balance and the political commitment is at the core of a future of arms control and the core of a cooperative verification regime.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Amy. I especially enjoy the part about where you mentioned that verification is not looking for violations, and that it's partially also reaching the political judgment on how the data matches. Hopefully we'll be able to talk about that a little bit deeper in the Q&A section. And to move on, I'd like to welcome Nick Ritchie. He'll be introducing to us the concept of verification as management and how adversarial and cooperative verification differs. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Vivian, and thanks, Pavel, for inviting me to come and speak to you all. I'm going to talk about nuclear disarmament verification around these themes of adversarial and cooperative approaches in the context of thinking about nuclear disarmament verification and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that stems from work commissioned by Pavel for the report that Pavel and I and others contributed to that John mentioned at the outset. So I'm going to start by just saying a couple of things, really picking up from Amy's remarks on the logic of an arms control approach to nuclear disarmament verification in terms of the current narratives and processes, and then say a bit about what happens when that meets what's anticipated under the TPNW. I think the first thing to note is that the current nuclear disarmament verification agenda is very much derived from the East-West Cold War arms control experience of the type that Amy has just set out, and from mainly Western ideas and assumptions about verification and its requirements. And that agenda is dominated by those states at the center of power in the global politics of nuclear weapons, which are chiefly the US and Russia, together with France, the UK, and to a lesser extent, China, and some of the US's allies. And the assumptions and ideas underpinning an arms control approach to nuclear disarmament verification have become quite embedded, really, as a sort of common sense without much alternative thinking. And this agenda has four main ideas that I'll just set out. The first is that a multilateral or plurilateral nuclear disarmament process will look something like, or will be an extension of the US, Soviet, and Russian nuclear arms control verification experience, and will therefore be shaped by its ideas, its practices, and these assumptions of adversarial relationships between the parties to such a process. The second idea is that nuclear weapons will remain very highly valued assets through any disarmament process, primarily because the logic of nuclear deterrence will still prevail. That's certainly the understanding. And that will remain so through and beyond any future disarmament process. It's because of this that any change in the balance of nuclear capabilities at very low numbers is seen as something that will be very significant and very dangerous. So the logic then follows that effective nuclear disarmament requires very high levels of intrusiveness in order to deter, and if necessary, as Amy said, respond in some timely manner to non-compliance and potential breakout in a disarmament situation that would result in some state having a nuclear monopoly. The third idea here is that even if a very high level of intrusiveness becomes politically possible, it will have to be circumscribed by a requirement to restrict access to proliferative or classified information in any verification process, information about nuclear warheads, fissile materials, operational environments, and so on. But what counts as such information is determined by the nuclear armed states. But the narrative is that barriers to progress here can potentially be overcome through technological solutions, hence lots of investment in technological solutions to this political challenge. And fourth, at the end of this set of ideas is the argument that this is all necessary because the risk of nuclear breakout after a disarmament process is considered both high and unacceptable. And so if a nuclear disarmament verification regime is understood by one or more nuclear armed states to be unable to verify compliance to the degree of assurance that's required to reduce a risk of nuclear breakout below some kind of threshold that's determined by the nuclear armed states, then nuclear disarmament itself will just be considered too risky and won't happen. This is the set of ideas, a logic, if you like, that underpins the current approach to nuclear disarmament verification that's very much rooted in the logic and practice of arms control verification. The current high value that's ascribed to nuclear weapons within an adversarial arms control paradigm generates requirements for very intrusive verification in order to preclude dangerous breakout scenarios, and all whilst trying to limit somehow possible release of proliferative or classified information. And as Amy suggested at the end, this all then in turn actually limits the possibilities for actual nuclear disarmament, because the requirements become so onerous on the one hand, and because disarmament is still considered, as we know, unnecessary or unlikely or dangerous as far as in the capitals of the nuclear armed states. So I want to juxtapose that now against against what we might imagine a disarmament approach to look like or involve under the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And there's a couple of things to note here. First, nuclear disarmament verification within the context of an interstate arms reduction framework will be quite different, I think, to verification within a disarmament framework that's anticipated under the TPNW. And of course, the crucial difference is that arms control is an attempt to manage and to regulate a system of security that's based on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, in which there are still nuclear weapons in existence, and in which nuclear weapons therefore remain very highly valued, in which the risk of nuclear violence is something to be managed because deterrence is still considered essential to security. Disarmament, on the other hand, a nuclear disarmament process, as anticipated under the Ban Treaty, is something different. It's an attempt to manage a system of security without nuclear weapons, without nuclear deterrence, and one crucially in which nuclear weapons are of either very low or entirely negative value, and in which the risk of nuclear violence must be eliminated because nuclear deterrence has been determined as too dangerous an approach to security. And because of these differences, the underlying assumptions about the politics of nuclear disarmament verification in terms of cooperation and trust are quite different. And I think what's important here is that a verified disarmament process through the TPNW would almost by definition be a cooperative process. It would be amenable to what's been described as managerial rather than adversarial approaches to verification. And I think also by an understanding that potential nuclear breakout, yes, will be a very serious development, but not so revolutionary a development as to prevent nuclear disarmament happening in the first place. And this is all because of the much lower value and legitimacy that nuclear weapons would necessarily have to have for a disarmament process to take place in the first place. And as such, the disarmament verification process between a nuclear armed state and the TPNW's competent international authority, and this is a crucial difference, I think, between the East-West arms control process. This wouldn't be an interstate verification process. This would be between the TPNW's as yet to be established international authority and one or more nuclear armed states. That would, in all likelihood, be a cooperative process. Almost by definition, because of the political transformation that would accompany a strategic decision of Beijing or London or Washington or New Delhi or Moscow to actually disarm, and the very significant changes in the value of nuclear weapons for the disarming state. And just a couple of other things. The cooperative nature of this sort of disarmament process would be compounded by the power asymmetries between a nuclear armed state or states, particularly those that are currently regional or global powers, and the TPNW's competent authority. That power asymmetry will be really quite stark, and the power to shape the verification agenda will lie chiefly with the nuclear armed state, particularly if they choose a destroy then join option under the TPNW. Now, just to finish my remarks, research on verification regimes shows that managerial approaches focus on cooperation, transparency, dispute settlement, things like capacity building, problem solving, consultation to address non-compliance concerns, and so on. More of that rather than enforcement through a process of threats and punishment. And I think this is likely to be the only plausible pathway for a nuclear disarmament verification process between a disarmed or disarming nuclear armed state and the TPNW's competent authority. And because of this, I think that some of the current requirements for very intrusive verification, for trying to grapple technologically with the political problem of potential access to proliferative information and the salience of the fear of nuclear breakout, all of which seem to make a a credible, valid disarmament verification process seem all but impossible at the moment. I think that will change. It would necessarily so as the value and legitimacy of nuclear weapons declines in an actual nuclear disarmament process under the TPNW. I'll leave my remarks there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nick, for your presentation, for the very interesting framework to understand verification and disarmament. And next, I would like to invite Pavel for his presentation. But before that, I want to remind everyone that you can submit written questions at any time throughout the Q&A, throughout the entire presentation with the Q&A function. And next, Pavel will discuss how verification works as a mechanism for states to demonstrate their commitments to obligations. Pavel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Vivian. And I would like to thank Emmy and Nick for their contribution to our projects on verification, and for all the many discussions that we had, and what I know from those discussions. That and I would want to maybe take your ideas a little bit further and explore kind of the idea of verification and what in my view I came to believe is the essential element. Again, as you just heard, the verification is a complex process, of course, and it is a deeply political process. And also the way we think about verification is kind of a meta thing. It is also a political process. Sort of the way we design verification requirements. It is also reflects our views of the political context. And in a way, it's a curse, but it's also a blessing. In that we think about verification and as a process that includes a political judgment, and it is in some ways again it's a problem because it is you're getting into politics, but also it helps because that allows us to think about verification slightly different. So verification, there are many definitions. I like the one that the Nuclear Threat Initiative (NTI) came up with, which is it's a set of national and cooperative activities, tools, procedures that allow you to, and fundamentally judgment about what is happening with regard to specific activities defined in the treaty. And this is, again, I would emphasize the part that says the judgment and the part that says what is happening. And so we use verification process as a way of making our judgment about what is going on. Of course, we want to know if the state is complying with its obligations. And of course, the way we normally think about it is that we design provisions to detect violations, and with the theory that it will deter violations. And this is how the things generally work with the, for example, the IAEA safeguards. There are strict rules, there are significant quantities of materials, there are timeliness requirements. And this is mostly how it worked in the US Soviet and US Russian arms control. And that's, again, as Nick mentioned, that sort of shaped us, our thinking about these things. But again, the outright violations, in fact, are extremely rare. And if we look at the specific cases when compliance concerns were raised, those reflected the failure of cooperate with the investigation more than actual diversion of a significant quantity of material or deployment of extra missiles or things like that. So that was, and in fact, if you think about it, that feature of the process is in fact, in a way, gives you the most reliable tool of detecting non-compliance. Because the way you will detect reluctance of a state to go along with the verification procedures much earlier on than you would detect the actual violation. So that's the that is, in my view, that cooperative nature of the process gives you kind of a better tool in a way of forming your judgment about compliance. So at the same time, if you think about it this way, then, and this is one of my favorite ideas about verification recently, is that you could think about verification arrangements not as a tool of, not even in the NTI definition sense, as a tool of making your judgment about what's happening to certain activities. But basically, you could think about verification as a tool that gives a state a way to positively prove its compliance with certain obligations that state assumes. It could be treaty, it could be voluntary unilateral obligation, but it is a tool. And it is important here that in many cases, the role of tool procedures and the role of definitions becomes slightly different. In a way, in many cases, for example, we're talking about non-proliferation. For many states, it would be, the judgment would be kind of sufficient. For example, if we ask if New Zealand has a nuclear weapon program, you use your judgment and you easily arrive to conclusion that no, New Zealand doesn't have a program. But at the same time, it is valuable that New Zealand, as many other states, has the way of positively demonstrating that. And for that, it is also important, in my view, that the verification arrangements should be, I would say, reasonably painful. Sort of, they should involve certain activity, and they should be reasonably comprehensive and reasonably technical. So they would give you a way again to demonstrate compliance. But we should keep in mind that the technical part of this process is not necessarily the most important one. For example, you could, you know about the, when the IAEA gives the safeguard conclusion about a certain state, it could reach what is called a broader conclusion that says that the IAEA has confidence that the state does not have undeclared, all declared materials are in peaceful use, and there are no undeclared activities. So this is as broad as you kind of, this is a clean bill of health from the IAEA. And you would think that that would mean that the IAEA could really certify that there are no significant quantities of plutonium that are missing, but that's not the case. There are states that, for example, Kazakhstan has this terrible legacy of the Soviet nuclear test program, and as a result of that, there is some amount of plutonium that is still underground in Semipalatinsk. And nobody really knows, and will never know how much plutonium is there. But that does not prevent the IAEA from giving Kazakhstan this clean bill of health and certifying that all the materials are in peaceful use. Because again, there are many ways for state, Kazakhstan in particular, to demonstrate its compliance. And indeed, if you look at other examples, this demonstrative nature of verification disarmament, it is interesting that you could look at the Soviet-US Russian arms control when the element, when they were cutting those missiles in pieces in the INF treaty, when they were blowing them up, that was a very kind of a symbolic thing. So in a way, if a state wants to prove to you that it is serious about disarming, it will find a way to do so. What is important here, though, is that we need to think about verification arrangements in a way that kind of emphasizes this element. Sort of, we need about verification as a tool to positively prove compliance. And that doesn't mean that there is no technical element. It doesn't mean that there is we should completely forget about the on-site inspections and things like that. No, but I think Amy mentioned very correctly that just the process of inspectors going to a site where they go and inspect, and the fact that they do that through by the book and everything, so that the compliance with that process is a very strong sign of compliance with the broader obligations. Let me stop here because I'm out of time, and I hope we'll get into. I have one good example for something that Nick mentioned about the value of weapons, but I hope we'll get to that. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Pavel, for the presentation. We certainly would like to hear the example, perhaps after we open the Q&A segment. So now that we have arrived at the time for that, I want to open the floor to questions and comments. So again, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen for this. And please also do indicate whether you want us to address your questions to specific speakers or to the entire panel. If you also wish to be identified, please write your name and your affiliation in the message. Otherwise, we'll treat the questions as anonymous. Before that, we already have a question from our guest of honor, Dr. John Borey. Would you like to pose the question yourself to the panelists?
Sure, Vivian. I think guest of honor might be overdoing it, but I'm very happy to ask a question. And I first want to say thank you to all the panelists. I think they were very, very interesting, thought-provoking talks. And, you know, even in a brief time, I think they raised a lot of very interesting points. I guess this is a question for all of the panel, but it refers back to something that Amy spoke about verification. And I'm paraphrasing Amy, I may not have caught it correctly. So what I'm hoping with this question is you'll unpack it a bit, and so will other presenters. You sort of talked about verification being possible when the parties involved judge that it's to their benefit to do so. We currently seem to be in an international situation where, I mean, frankly, the possibility of that seems pretty remote. My question for all of you is, what kind of specific thing, I mean, what should we be looking out for? What kind of thing might change the current calculus between any, some, or all of the nuclear armed states? And I guess there's a TPNW dimension here too, because Nick, you're sort of talking about this transformational process that would happen over time, and I guess I'm wondering, then, is the expectation that the TPNW might over time accumulate enough I guess, normative or moral force that it might become a factor in that regard. So back to you.
Let me jump in first. My point was that arms control is possible when the two parties or all the parties determine it's in their national security interest that the benefits exceed the costs. And one thing that makes that calculation come out on the positive side is that there's confidence in compliance. And one thing that contributes to confidence in compliance is a robust verification regime. So it's a multi-step process. But there is no doubt that no matter how robust the verification regime, you're not going to get an arms control process unless the parties believe that restricting their weapons and cooperating with each other to manage competition serves their national security interests. And everything I've been writing for the last few months admits wholeheartedly we are not in that place. If anything, we are moving further away from that place. It's hard to find positive reinforcement within government circles. Now, you can find it in NGOs, but within government circles for the idea that we should be moving forward on formal treaties that limit or reduce nuclear weapons, or a formal process that transforms the world to one without nuclear weapons. There's a lot of nuclear risk generation going on out there when what we really need is nuclear risk mitigation. And one way to get back to the point where the participating nations, either in a bilateral or multilateral process, see value in managing competition and mitigating risks is to take it step by step. You can't just dive back into the full-blown 50 years on model of US-Soviet arms control. It's not going to happen that way. So you start over with some of the baby steps we used in the 1960s. Normative statements about the costs of nuclear war, communications channels. I mean, recently I was asked what I would recommend as a first step, and I said the most important thing we can do right now is to not only keep open the communication channels, but exercise them. Just remember how to do it. Remember how to manage crises and move forward down the path of other notifications, risk reduction, cooperation. And so we build back the muscle memory. And I realize that's not a satisfying path. It doesn't get us on the road to nuclear disarmament. It doesn't get us to Nick's world that is transformed. I have trouble seeing how to get from here to Nick's world because there's this big gap in the middle. Right now, all the nuclear weapon states see high value for their national security in having, if not brandishing, nuclear weapons. And Nick is talking about a world where they just go, never mind. And I'm not quite sure what's in the middle there. Maybe Nick can figure that out for me. But the fact is, you start with baby steps, and hopefully once you start conversations, you get back to the table that eventually gets to the more serious conversations about managing competition and reducing weapons.
Thank you very much, Amy. We have Pavel's hand up. Pavel, would you like to respond?
Yeah,
And
just I'll try to add briefly. I agree with Amy, but I would actually say that in a way, yes, we definitely. It's hard to see how we will get to the arms control of the late 80s, early 90s with all these START type of things. But at the same time, again, my take is that arms control, you could also think of arms control as a way of showing that you want to exercise certain restraint here in certain activities, and you expect sort of, and it doesn't have to be legally binding. It doesn't have to be a treaty or things like that. We could, for example, I could imagine, for example, the United States and Russia kind of abstaining from deploying INF range missiles in Europe, and doing it without any agreement, but at the same time doing it in a verifiable way, because there are ways for them to show that they are not doing certain things if they really want to show that. And so these kind of tacit agreements, I think it is they are possible. They are not easy, but I think it's could be done. And very briefly, I think, and this is I always tell people these days that looking at the situation we are in, it is indeed easy to conclude sort of that, oh, nuclear weapons are so relevant. But I would argue that we could look at this and make a good argument that nuclear weapons are very much useless on top of the fact that they are very dangerous. And I think this is for us to kind of internalize this, kind of think about that, and not to ask ourselves this question, sort of, do they actually help, or do they not? And so let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick, please.
Thanks. I guess just to clarify the work that I did for the project for Pavel, that was a question of looking at the likely parameters of a nuclear disarmament verification process under the TPNW, rather than the process by which a nuclear armed state or states might get to the point where they are wanting to join the TPNW through disarming. Because as you say, Amy, we are a very, very long way from that. And I guess I would just perhaps make a couple of points, if I may. First of all, I think there are two foundational ideas that give verification meaning. One is the idea of the value of shared restraint on the means of violence for mutual benefit, which is another way of saying that it has to be in states that participate in such a process in their shared interests. And second, I think another foundational idea is that the idea of building confidence for mutual benefit of the parties involved through demonstrating adherence to an agreement, that needs to be there too. And arms control debates during the Cold War showed us just how contested those very basic ideas can be, as they are now, to the point where they have no real political support in the capitals of Moscow and Beijing and Washington. But we've been here before in terms of commitments to the value of those ideas that then enable conversations to be had about arms control. But if the idea of shared restraint as something mutually beneficial, the idea of building confidence through you and your partners in an agreement demonstrating adherence to that agreement, if those things are of no value, then you're not going to have participation in an arms control process. And I think the second point just to note is certainly in the East-West arms control process, the underlying set of ideas were that arms control was necessary to, or seen as necessary to stabilize an arms competition between East and West, and to restrict weapons that one side or both sides viewed as destabilizing in a crisis. Destabilizing because the theory of crises around nuclear weapons and missile defenses and so on led to arguments that if certain weapons go unrestrained, they can incentivize early use in a crisis. But if an arms competition is seen as either not underway or not sufficiently destabilizing at the moment, and I think maybe we are there, and if there isn't, serious fear of nuclear crises through which that can be ameliorated through agreements to restrain weapon systems that one or both sides view as really destabilizing in a crisis. If those ideas aren't there, then that logic of arms control from the Cold War isn't going to have any political purchase. And I'm not sure that we are there. I mean, a lot of these ideas really gained ground after we've been through the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago, right? I mean, maybe what's happening with Ukraine will, over the next 5 or 10 years, prompt some renewed political interest at higher levels in some of these basic ideas. But I think we're going to have to wait and see, but we're certainly not there now.
And thank you very much, Nick. I'd like to move on to questions that we received from the audience. We have one question here, which asks, verification issues have been named by NATO members as one of the reasons for hesitation to engage with the TPNW. How might the disarmament community approach these concerns in order to invoke further engagement? Is this possible given the current security concerns and NATO's nuclear alliance declarations? I believe this is posed to the entire panel as there's no specific panelist mentioned. And I see Pavel has his hand up. Pavel, please.
Yeah, I think I hope Nick also has something to say here, because it is in a way this criticism of the TPNW as not sufficiently verifiable. I think it is a political, it's a power play. It's a political tool, and that's Nick wrote a very good chapter on that. I just want to add to that if you, from the technical standpoint, sort of if you have a nuclear weapon state that comes to you and says, okay, we want to disarm, we want to eliminate our program, there are absolutely no technical issues. There are no issues with sensitive information. You could set up a process that would do that. And if you have, again, it would be reasonably painful in my classification. So, and you will have a reasonable confidence that you've completed the process. So you will have reasonable confidence that the state is not hiding a few bombs under the bed. But again, it is all these questions are technically possible. So there is nothing there to invent even. Thanks.
Amy has her hand up. Amy, please.
I think part of this becomes easier, and Pavel and Nick keep referring to it, but if you change your jargon a bit, is the TPNW verifiable? What are you trying to verify? You're trying to confirm that the parties are compliant with their commitment to eliminate and not possess nuclear weapons or nuclear infrastructure. That's a long sentence of saying, can you verify they're in bounds of the treaty? But if you define what your endpoint is and what the processes of getting there, then you can determine how one achieves confidence that that's going on. Verifiability is just too broad and in some ways too deep. You need to be specific. So as Nick has said, that you can have cooperative verification demonstrating, as Pavel says, that you're compliant with your obligations without it being an adversarial process. And quite a bit of the US, Russian, US, Soviet arms control history follows that model. We demonstrate that we've eliminated weapons by, as Pavel mentioned, crushing the INF missiles. That's verified compliance by demonstrating that you're getting rid of them. So if you broaden your terminology and your understanding of what verification means, confidence and compliance with the specific terms of the treaty, then you can put together pieces and packages of how you create that confidence. Some of it may be adversarial, a lot of it isn't.
Thank you very much, Amy. And we're already moving very quickly towards the end of the event. So I'd like to, in closing, ask a final question to the panelists. Please also respond to this briefly in 2 minutes if you can. So I wonder, what 2 steps do you think are the most important to moving nuclear verification forward? What 2 recommendations or take-home points would you put forward to states? It would be great if I can hear from Nick, Amy, and then Pavel, please.
Okay, that's a difficult question in the current context. Clearly, there needs to be a capacity building, I think, and a much more inclusive process in terms of the current nuclear disarmament verification programs that are currently underway. The only one that's been really inclusive was the UN group of governmental experts that looked at these issues. The rest have been very broadly Western based, in part because some countries have removed themselves from some of these nuclear disarmament verification programs, Russia and China in particular from US-led programs. But I think building up our shared understanding beyond the nuclear armed states and their allies of what nuclear disarmament verification is going to be really important in the context of the TPNW, building that capacity, building that level of understanding and acquaintance with the set of challenges and cases and technologies involved in nuclear disarmament verification. In part, that's about empowering the broader set of states that are pushing for progress on nuclear disarmament through the NPT and now through the TPNW.
Thank you very much, Nick. Would we be able to hear from Amy next, please?
Sure. The two things that I would like to see happen. Well, one is already happening, and it's critical to both the technical and the political side of a verification regime. On the monitoring technologies, there's a huge amount of work going on. It has been going on for years, both to develop new technologies. There's a lot of writing. There's interest in how to use open source information, in developing the capabilities to collect the data that you would need to determine confidence and compliance. So that needs to continue with the understanding that it's not enough. Now, I think it's important, but I also think it's important that it's not enough. All the technology in the world isn't going to tell you whether you're seeing compliance if you don't know what compliance looks like. But it is truly necessary, particularly for the political side of it that says, we need even more information, we need more intrusiveness, we need more data. Well, let's see how much we can get without stepping over the boundary to interfering with countries' security interests. So that process needs to continue. And UNIDIR does a lot of work in that, so I'm going to pitch that. But the second side of it is to recognize that verification is a political process, that no amount of data and technology is going to answer the question of whether the limits and restrictions you're talking about are in your national security interest. And building up that side of it, both, I mean, I've worked for the United States Congress for decades, so the politics of arms control sit at my front door all the time. But members of an administration or a government or a country or a legislature are going to have different measurements for what's in the national security interest than those of us in the arms control community that figure out whether 3 more of these weapons or 2 fewer of those are in our interest. So you have to step back while you're developing the capabilities to get all the little pieces of data, to step back and recognize that the political interests of the parties participating in the process is much broader than how many items and how much data.
Thank you very much, Amy. And lastly, Pavel, please, very briefly.
I will just echo what Nick and Amy just said. It is, yeah, in my view, if we're talking about nuclear disarmament verification, again, as Amy mentioned, there is a lot of work that is being done. What I think is important here is to back away from thinking that it is all about technology, that you need to, and back away from thinking that unless you could chase down each 100 grams of plutonium, you can never have a secure weapon-free world. That is, and this is, again, that was one of the motivations behind this report and behind the chapter that I asked Nick to write, that this idea that it is all in the in your ability to detect every little gram, that we need to change. And there are, I do believe that we need more investment into different institutional arrangements, and we've been working on that, verifying the absence of weapons, and sort of you could build a process around that, and we see progress in this area, but again, I would definitely like to see more of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'm afraid we've run out of time. So from our side, I'd like to thank all three speakers for their insights, and also to our team at UNIDIR that helped produce this event. And in closing, I want to express our gratitude to Dr. John Borey for joining us at this event, and to the government of New Zealand for supporting UNIDIR's work on issues related to nuclear disarmament verification. And lastly, thank you to the audience for joining us today for what has been a stimulating discussion. There were many questions really showing the interest that this issue stimulates, and that hopefully we can continue this conversation in the future. And sorry that we cannot get to all of the questions. I want to invite you once again to explore the publications we have discussed today, and also remind you that we have another event coming tomorrow, starting at the same time as today, with another stellar roster of speakers who will be addressing the nuclear risks of outer space activities. So please do join us again by registering for the event on Eventbrite, and the link is also included in the chat. Just before we close, if I could encourage all of you to fill in our online feedback form. It will take only 1 minute and it's anonymous. It helps us improve events moving forward. The link is also now included in the chat, and you might be redirected to it after closing your Zoom window. So thank you very much for joining us today.